from the depth instant tutorial.
This is Eric and we're back with instant tutorials. It's time to talk about armor again. So if we're building here on this little structure, we can go into blocks. And armor is of course blocks we use to protect our crafts from incoming damage. To put it simply, armor is a combination of health and armor class. If you look at this wood block, a square meter of wood has 200 health points and 8 armor. So the armor on the block here, the 8 armor, is called Armour Class. For weapons, they usually have a AP value. And if the AP value is higher than the AC value or equal to it, it will deal full damage. But if the AP value is lower than the AC value, it will not deal full damage. We're gonna go into that a little bit more in detail. If we look at heavy armor, it has armor 60. Well, that means it's a lot better to protect you against armor penetrating shells than wood. It also has a lot more health. But if, for example, we have a shot that has more than 60 armor points in dealing its damage, well, at that point, our 60 armor won't really help at all. So if the armor doesn't help, it's actually more cost effective to have wood as armor. Because this wood blocks costs 1 material and this heavy armor blocks costs 25 materials. If you're anything like me, considering you're watching this video, you probably need a visual representation to understand this. Let's move over to this weapon platform. When we are making armor, it is important that the armor is as cheap as possible and as effective as possible. So that means that using heavy armor is usually not the best idea. This little slab of heavy armor costs as much as these 5 meters of metal, the most common armor. And that costs as much as these 25 meters of wood. And the funny thing is that health points per materials, wood is the best one of them all, absolutely the best one. But they have some drawbacks, of course. That's why people don't use it that much. So to understand armor, we will first need to demonstrate this. This is a gun testing station, of course, and we're going to check the APS here. If we scroll down here, we can see this is a pure sabot head. Now, we won't go into that in this video, but sabot heads and pure sabot shells is of course the most armor penetrating shell. You can see that the expected armor pierce, the AP value, is 107. That means that the benefits of having heavy armor is absolutely useless. And wood should perform much better under these circumstances, since we only need cheap health points. We're going to shoot a 150mm shot against these armor targets to test our thesis. The expected kinetic damage is 7000. So let's check that out. First, against the wood, in the upper right corner, you can see the damage dealt, which was 6000. So let's shoot against the metal slab. 6000 again. And finally, against the heavy armor. Here you can see that the heavy armor was the only armor that was penetrated during this test. You can clearly see here from this example that in this case, the wood did the absolute best. More than half of the metal armor was penetrated, but not even a third of the wooden armor was penetrated. And the heavy armor, well, it's breached. So now we're switching to a heavy head for comparison. The AP, armor piercing value, is lower. It's at 28 instead now. However, the kinetic damage is a lot higher. So let's check that out. And for a quick little reminder, wood's armor class is 8, metal's armor class is 40, and heavy armor's armor class is 60. Wood, 14,000 damage. Didn't get through though. Metal, 7,000 damage. Also didn't get through. So lastly, heavy armor, 5,000 damage. Didn't even get through. From that, we can conclude that when the enemy is using weapons that are really deeply armor penetrating, you will need to use blocks, a lot of blocks, that have the most health points per material. The best one is wood, the second best one is stone. But when the weapons don't have a very high AP value, well, then you can really get protected using armor. High armor. While wood may be technically best for a lot of scenarios, you can see that having 25 meters of wood is really thick. So you might understand that it's not really practical to do so. So that is something you should keep in mind when choosing armor. Do you have the space for it? If you have the space for it, you don't need to choose the most dense armor. But for things that has to be dense, like turret heads and turret necks and stuff like that, well, heavy armor is the obvious choice. Now we're getting back here to check some other armor basics. So, you may notice that a lot of from the depth builders try to prefer to use the 4-meter beams as much as possible. And that's no coincidence. It's not only because it's easier to build that way, it is also a very simple fact. You see this block? It has 350 health. So, the block that's twice as large should have exactly 700 health. It does not. It has 770 health. And at the bottom there, you can see extra health from being bigger. So, the game rewards us for using bigger blocks, because if we have too many blocks, the game will lag so much. If you're building a ship that has more than 100,000 blocks, it will usually lag too much for most people to have like 2 of these ships facing each other. So the 4-meter blocks, the largest block, is a 20% health bonus. And that's huge. So you really want to try and use the biggest blocks that you can. 4-meter, this one, 20% bonus. Now, this is a little fun secret I realized in a Gimli battle recently. This block, the 4-meter offset, it has a 5-meter length, so it gets 25% bonus. Yeah. Now, there is another fun thing you can do too to add some armor. If you go into air and go into ducts, there are some really large ducts here. And these ducts, well, they are so large, so they are a little bit sheety in a way, so you don't get that bonus, of course. But having a heavy armor duct like this, it weighs a lot, it does, but it will give you a health of 37,500. That's a lot. So you can see that these ducts actually come with a little premium cost. If you see this heavy armor duct 3x3, it has a material cost of 350. And if you look at this 3-meter beam and take this times 3, well, you're not getting to 350 at all. That is because the game don't want us to only use the ducts because stuff looks funny. However, if you need to create a sheet that is protecting something from incoming damage, like if you have a front sider and, for example, you're facing an Army of Gmodism vessel equipped with the Arqueballista Invictus, as you probably have seen in the Gimli battles, well, then it can be a good idea to have a sheet of super high health ducts like this, and that will protect you from being penetrated by the most heavy APS penetrators. Let's go through some armor basics. So, if you go into your Z menu, as in zebra, you will see the Health and AC tool. Drag this down to your toolbar. If you choose this tool, you will get some stats when you're looking at different blocks. You will see their armor class, as we went through before, and their health. Armor is essentially whatever protects your system blocks. They are mostly found in the blocks menu. Lead is one of the worst blocks for armor, of course. It's very heavy as heavy armor. It's pretty cheap, but it doesn't give you enough health points and armor for that cost. In that case, stone is better. Wood is, as previously mentioned, the most amount of health points for your materials, and in some sense the best kinetic defense armor. However, since your structure becomes very big if you want to use it, stone is usually a better choice for this, because it is as heavy as metal. As you can see here, at least at this update of the game, it might change. As always, check your numbers yourself. But it has a much higher armor class than wood. Now, armor class doesn't only matter when we're talking about kinetic. No, we have some other stats to keep in mind too. When we're dealing with explosions, when we're receiving explosive damage, having armor is really good. And then, when someone is using fragmentation damage against you, like for example crams with frag pellets. Each of these frag pellets, as of now at least, have only 4 in AP value. That means that even wood provides some defense against fragmentations, and of course, stone a lot more. So both when we're talking kinetics and when we're talking explosions, well, armor class matters. Like armor class, we have something that was added with the fire update. We have fire resistance. Wood's fire resistance is 10. I think the default flamer's value is 20, so it's way above that resistance. However, stone's fire resistance is 50. So that gives some pretty good protection. Stone is the best block to protect against fire, for example. Alloy also has 50 fire resistance, which is nice, but it also has a 25% flammability. That means when a fire destroys this block, it will add fuel to the fire. Metal has a lower fire resistance, but no flammability, which makes it a good protection against fire as well. Heavy armor has a very high fire resistance, but it also has a big flammability. That means that because they are so dense, they can contribute a little bit to the fire, but they're pretty resistant too. Rubber is the most flammable block at 100% flammability. Wood is close behind at 80. So that's also a stat to keep in mind when we're choosing the armor. Armor that is below water will of course be much better protected against fire. Moving on, we have alloy, which has an armor class of 35. However, the alloy block is very light. You can see its relative buoyancy is plus 32, which is a lot more floaty than even wood, which is weird. But it has a weight of 5, so it has half the weight of even wood, which is the next most light block. Stone and metal is at the same weight, and heavy armor and lead is at the same weight. Be careful with that heavy armor, your thing might become very heavy. Metal, the most useful armor block altogether, has 40 armor class, which is a good bit more than alloy, but they have the same cost. So using metal, if you can take the weight, is always better. Heavy armor has an armor class of 60, which is of course amazing, but the cost makes it so that you should use it very carefully. The only block that has some decent armor class that's not super expensive is the applique panels. Applique panels are pretty volatile, they only have 125 health. That is about half the health of a wood block. However, they have 50 in armor class, which means that they provide a decent defense against fragmentation, heat fragmentations, hash fragmentations, and explosions in some sense too. Applique panels is pretty shallow too, so it can be a great thing to add to things that need to have a lower profile, like aircraft or whatnot. Metal and alloy plate should be more seen as decorations. Of course, they provide some bit of protection, just like applique panels, due to them having a decent armor class. But they have so little health that people usually say that they will fly off when you sneeze on them. Now we come to a little interesting aspect. Most armor blocks can be stacked. You can see here that the armor class of this is now 48. But you know from before that the metal block's armor class is actually 40. It adds armor because it's structurally sound. Adds armor to other structural blocks, it says. So if we add another one, it's not changed. Only 1 meter behind it boosts the armor in front of it. That means that we can take a really strong block and back wood with. So if we look at heavy armor backed wood, we have an armor class of 20, which is of course a lot more than wood, since wood usually only has 8. So if you want to have pretty strong wood, well, you can back it up with heavy armor and you have some pretty sturdy wood there. Honorable mention is of course reinforced wood. It's basically a weird mix between wood and metal, but honestly, it's really terrible in every sense, and it's only if you can't have the space of having 1 layer of metal under 1 layer of wood that you would use reinforced decking. Reinforced decking is of course a nice decoration block that's a little bit more sturdy than wood. Now, alloy plates, applique panels and ERA don't really add to the armor behind it. So they can be added as an extra layer of course, but they won't boost anything. ERA armor is explosive reactive armor. If you shoot this, it explodes, but it can instantly delete heat and HESH shells, which otherwise can be very scary. Now we need to talk a little bit about angle. The angle a projectile comes at the surface matters too. Here we have a very simple 52mm armed with a heavy head. Let's shoot this slope. 26. Because it comes at an angle, the damage dealt is less. If we instead turn this block around and shoot it again, it deals 86. So when things come into a slope, they deal less damage. You remember the AC versus the AP value. If we're having an AC value that's a lot higher than the armor piercing value, well, then we get an interesting phenomena. Watch this board behind. You can see it bounces. Sometimes it will bounce, and sometimes it will be absorbed into that slab. However, those times when the shot is absorbed, like now, it deals minuscule amounts of damage because this AP value is so much lower than this armor class. So that you can make it ricochet off surfaces and thus dealing so little damage. Another little point we will cover briefly is fire resistance. So we're gonna start some example fires. We can see here that the fuel is of course being decreased when the stone is burning up, but of course the stone doesn't add anything to the fuel. The fuel on the metal is also not being added any, so you can see here on the alloy it has more fuel left. Here on the wood it actually almost has as much fuel as when it started. Now you can see that while it hasn't destroyed the first heavy armor block yet, it's pretty interesting because you can see that the intensity actually decreases or increases dependent on what block it's burning down. And here, one block got destroyed, but fortunately for the fire, it just escaped adding that fuel to the fire. In any case, looking at this, you might think that heavy armor is a fantastic fire defense. And do you remember that heavy armor is pretty expensive though? So if we compare that to metal or stone, which is even cheaper than metal, metal and stone is actually the fire resistance champions, not heavy armor. Now, what's the most effective defense against fire? Well, that's an air gap. Fire won't jump distances in the air for some reason. I don't know, it's just how it works. Now what we need to cover is a little bit about EMP defense. So when we look at different blocks, we can see that this local weapon controller, for example, has an EMP susceptibility of 100. Here we have a surge protector. They can be placed down to absorb surges from EMPs. This has also a 100% EMP susceptibility, and that basically means it can be hurt by EMP. Example of these are AIs, weapon controllers, laser systems, and many others. EMP is really scary because it tries to deal the most amount of damage it can deal with the path of least resistance. Some bit different blocks lead EMP surges a lot better than others. Like wood and stone are decent insulators, and metal is a very bad insulator. It just leads them away. as well as heavy armor. It just leads them very easily. Rubber is the only block that provides proper EMP insulation. So rubber, you need to insulate important parts. Here we have a couple of weapon controllers. And here we have a couple of insulated weapon controllers. If we put an EMP surge here, you can see it goes and attacks this block, which now has been damaged to about 50% of its original health. An EMP can be a little bit weird to understand. If we have a smaller jolt, like 17,000 EMP damage, you can see it goes to destroy these blocks on the side. Now these are insulated, and EMP wants to choose the least part of resistance, but because there is nothing other, it will jump that rubber insulation anyways. So it's important to have some EMP surge protector as well. But the weird thing is, if we have a really big EMP surge, it will actually just bypass these and go down into the main structure, because there is some other blocks inside of here, like these surge protectors built into the structure, that of course have a lot more health points to hit for. So it's kind of weird. EMP is kind of conscious. The smaller charges try to go for smaller targets, and the big charges try to go for the biggest targets. That's something to keep in mind. When you're building your system, you always want to have surge protectors on some strategic places. Like if we just have a tiny little surge protector here, so if you have a pretty big EMP blast here, and we send it going, it will actually go for this tiny little surge protector. And the funny thing is, when EMP has gone away, it can't go back. So you'll need to think on how you can isolate it in a point and make it absorb at that spot. We have some tutorials that go through EMP more carefully though. Now let's look at some practical armoring examples if we were making this little boat here. So most boat hulls are built out of metal or alloy. This one is built out of metal. Only when you need a really fast thing, you can of course having alloy as well on the outside instead. But generally, metal is very awesome. So for the outer layer of your armor, you usually want 2 layers. You can have 2 layers of metal if you want to have a sturdy construction that can take a lot of beating. If you, however, are looking to get a little bit of a better weight and more floatiness, you can instead back it up with alloy, like this. Then we get a nice passive float. If you instead want to back up your armor, but you need to save some costs, you can always back it up with stone instead, and you get a little bit of a cheaper option. Now, if you need to protect yourself against most different types of damage, you have your plasma, you have your HESH, you have your heat, and other type of shape charges. Well, you need to have an air gap. And for plasma, and also fire, you need a proper air gap, not like a fake air gap. Some people like to have some spall catchers, they're called. So when heat is coming in, you want them to catch that spall, and thus you can have beam slopes is the most and best used thing for this. But if you want to protect yourself against plasma too, you'll need to leave this space in between. So we have a free space. The best spall catcher there is actually the beam slope of heavy armor. It is a little bit expensive, of course, but this thing can take HESH and heat beatings all day. And the best thing to back it up with is of course a full block of heavy armor. Now this is only for very heavy armor and is where you should have your heavy armor if you're not coating it on the front side. You can back it up with alloy too to get some structural stability, but still more of that health. Most people, however, do some spall catchers using just regular metal beam slopes. They're fine for that. Another option, if you want to have a good bit of armor, but you can't really afford that heavy armor, well, you can have a layer of applique as a spall catcher instead. You can also add applique to the surface of your ship to make them detonate on the surface too. But for that application, it's actually better to have the ERA. Now, the ERA slopes and the ERA work the same way. They have exactly the same stats, except that the slopes are half the cost. So it's actually more efficient to only use slopes than the full blocks. They don't provide anything extra. If you want to protect yourself against armor-piercing fragmentation, you can add era backwards on the inside of the hull like this. Under the first surface on the inside, you can add a layer like this, and any shot that's coming in there that's armor-piercing payload or heat or hash will just not deal a lot of damage. That can be a good addition too, but of course remember, they're destroyed when they're shot at, so they're kind of single use. But worth it sometimes. There are different combinations to piece together, but you usually want to be cost effective. So if you, for example, have double metal or metal backed with stone, you can then add an air gap. An air gap is always good to have, and just back that up with some beam slopes. So say we have this, and if we have the way to do so, we can back this up with some stone, or if we don't, we can back it up with some wood, because wood is a really good health points for that cost. Having an air gap is always advisable though. If you back your metal with wood, you get some weird secondary effects we will talk a little bit about in future videos, but what it boils down to is that you have metal, which is good armor, and then you have the best health point sponge behind it. So you can even have this in several layers. Having checkerboards is not advisable anymore due to explosive damage being trapped in small spaces and dealing more damage. Thus, it's better to work with sheets than checkerboards. If you realize you need to change your ship, click the V menu and go into Armor Refit. A lot of people like to build with alloy and heavy armor. So, if we, for example, want to make this lightweight, we will change metal to alloy. And if we want to make it super lightweight, we can actually change stone to wood. And now we have a pretty lightweight design here. So working with a lot of alloy gives us a lot of weight to add to work to. Then, without being too heavy, we can add alloy, have some wood where we save costs, or just have alloy altogether. Like that. Now we have a super light alloy ship. Now we can use heavy armor where we need to use it to provide maximum protection, and back that with some more alloy to keep our weight in check. This is the most popular way to build things in from the depth. However, I would argue it's not the most cost-effective way. To build cost-effectively in terms of armor, you will want to work with a lot of wood, stone, and metal in different configurations, and alloy where you need to. I, for example, love to use alloy as interior armor, because it adds float, low weight, but still decent armor class. If you, however, love to build things as fast as possible, I would definitely try to use as much alloy as possible, and then use heavy armor or metal only where you need to use it. Because then you can get away with the smallest footprints, the least drags, the sleekest shapes, and thus the fastest speed. I believe that will be everything for this little episode here. Well, try to cover everything in under 15 minutes is pretty impossible, but I hope you learned everything you need about armor in general. We will be adding some new episodes to the instant tutorials in the future where we cover specialty armor, to armor against specific types of damage types, like laser, heat and hash, ape sham, just kinetics or whatever. We will do some special episodes for that, but this is the general armor guide so that you understand what armor is, how it works, and how to use it. If it was helpful, please leave a like, and do me a big favor and check out my other channels here, the Gmodist and the Gmodism relaxation channel, where you can find some sleep help content and whatnot. Those channels need to get a few more subscribers so that I can apply to the YouTube partnership program for them. That would be great. If you want to support the channel, you have the ecclesiarchy that you can join here, or if you want to become a commissioned officer, well, you're very welcome to join. This is your host Eric of Gmodism, and I'm signing out.